hope you remember to check for traps, because we have 5 actually interesting and unique traps for you to drag and drop into your next tabletop RPG adventure. Traps are landmark features of RPG dungeons, temples, and lairs, and most that exist in source material are bland and one-dimensional. Those are fine for minor dungeon filler, but we here at Roleplay like to make things 3-dimensional, interactive, and employ player agency. Unlike our video on 3 physically interactive dungeon challenges and our upcoming video on actually interactive dungeon puzzles, these are all strictly theater of the mind and involve no tabletop props, though they certainly can. The skills and abilities I'll be referencing are based upon the Dungeons & Dragons system, but these traps can be dragged and dropped into whatever awesome RPG system you're using. The best way you can make this channel's ambition of making celebrity guests on our one-shots and interviews a regular thing is just by clicking the like and subscribe buttons, the little notification bell button, and sharing our videos with people you think may enjoy them. If you've done those simple things, then thank you so much. But regardless, thank you just for being here. Now let's get started. The blade in the box. Our first trap is a box. Flavor it however you like, and place anything inside it that you like, whether it's a key to unlock the way onward, a sacred relic at the end of a dungeon, or a valuable item worth a fortune. Upon 2 opposite faces of the box is a hole large enough for a hand to slide in, and the object in question is secured in place inside the box. And the only way to relieve the tension gripping it is by sliding something as large and soft as a hand inside the chamber, pushing a series of tumblers, similar to a lock, as their hand slides in. But each tumbler is also a one-way facing blade that allows one to slide their hand in, but if they try to pull their hand out, the blades dig deeper and deeper. If they try to use force, their hand will be sliced off in a collection of ribbons. Once a player's hand is in, with the object in hand, or even loose enough to tilt the box and drop it out of the opposing hole, their hand is still stuck. If a character has the ability to cast the Enlarge Reduce spell, that can be a creative way of using their characters to solve this, and should certainly be rewarded. But the primary solution is a bit more creative. If one puts another hand into the other hole, the blades upon that side share the same pressure differential. Whichever side is pushed or flexed further takes more of the tension of the blades, so that the other person's hand can slide out. But the catch is that one hand is always stuck in the box. Which brings us to the solution. You see, shoving objects into the box doesn't work because the series of tumblers inside requires a balance of the squishiness yet solidity of flesh and bone as it's carefully slid in, pushing each tumbler. So, the players must use the hand of a corpse from a defeated foe to push into one end so that the player can then pull their hand out, leaving the empty box behind with that corpse. As a result, the placement of this trap should be in a location where combat has either already occurred and the players can circle back, or is maybe about to occur and the player with the box has to deal with this box stuck on their hand. If they originally check for traps and get a low roll or a failure, they see the object secured inside and they see a series of flashing bits of metal that look like edges of blades, and that's it. If they get a high roll or a success on their check, in addition to the above, they see that jabbing the first accessible blade with something small and rigid indicates that it's under tension and is able to be pushed up, with it being spring-loaded to push back down. There are 5 to 6 of these on each side of the box, and the blades clearly lean in one direction, making it easy to slide a hand in, but not to slide it back out. So toss this box into a dungeon with something valuable inside and see what happens. Trap number 2, getting warmer. Prepare for another trap where a player can lose a hand. The way onward requires a lever upon the wall to be pulled. Simple. You walk up and pull the lever? Awesome! Too bad you didn't check for traps. Those who don't search for traps discover that moving onward won't be so easy. When they pull the lever, the sealed doorway doesn't open, and the metal framing that outlines the slit for the lever springs off the wall and then snaps around their wrist. Through some trials and deduction, the players discover that the true lever, button, or knob to unlock the doorway is hidden within the very room that they're already in, and they'll know when they're getting closer to it because their new bracelet gets warmer and warmer as it tightens and burns deeper into their wrist, threatening to ultimately burn the hand off. The player has to willingly endure heightening, searing pain to find the key to their goal. Run this any way you want, but Here's how I do it. Mechanically, you set a total DC threshold of, say, 80 for their investigation checks. Each check gets them hotter and hotter as they get closer and closer to where the key is hidden. Each check deals more fire damage to them, say starting with 1d8 plus 4 after the first check, and then increases by 1d8 with each attempt. Again, scale all of these according to the player level. Each investigation check chips away at the threshold until they surpass it, and if done as a group, multiply the DC goal by the number of players. Allow spells, items, abilities, and of course, narrative applications to affect their checks accordingly. You can make this more brutal by treating any roll under a total of a 10, dealing damage as usual, but getting them no closer. Narratively depicting their character struggling and flinching at voluntarily stepping closer and amplifying their searing pain. To give the player more agency than just making a bunch of rolls, give them the option to rush in, rolling with advantage, but they add a d4 to a dice pool. When they cross the threshold of 80 for their checks and they locate the hidden item, they make one final DC 14 Constitution save when they finally find the key. But then they also roll this pool of d4s and subtract them from their total. If they fail, their hand is permanently seared off as a bracelet flares with one final burst of heat before the player discovers this key that unlocks their way onward. And it could be something as simple as a literal key that's maybe hidden in a particular way that makes it to where they needed the bracelet to use their heat to get hotter and find it, or perhaps it's a tiny hair-thin hole in the floor that needs a little pin needle to go in to activate the mechanism to go onward, or perhaps it's a particular section of stone that needs to be rotated 90 degrees. Since a player falling to 0 health and dying from just their hand is a bit illogical, during this challenge, if the player takes half their health in damage, then their hand is burnt off at the wrist, and the players can then use a blade or anything to hold the ring and move it about the room as it gets hotter and hotter the closer to their hidden key is until they find it. If they initially check for traps and get a low roll or a failure, they discover the framework around the lever is suspicious, and pushing against it causes it to depress a little bit against the wall, and they notice that when they do so, the lever twitches, indicating that they're likely connected somehow. Tinkering with it further triggers the trap. If they check for traps and get a high roll or a success, they discover the above and determine that the lever will spring the framing out, with evocation magic emanating from the metal framing. Using an object to activate the lever should safely spring the trap, though the getting hotter the closer to the key they get isn't immediately revealed. They still have to figure that out, but it can be safely done by holding it with a pair of tongs or the edge of a blade and walking about the room, seeing if it gets hotter or colder until they find their key. Trap number 3, the mask. You set off an invisible tripwire, causing the heavy stone sliding door to the pathway onward at the other end of the room to slowly slide down and then halt as you hastily back away. The walls of this ancient tribal tomb depict masked individuals contorting to avoid dangers as they traverse a gauntlet. It is then that you notice hanging upon a hook upon the wall amongst the collection of tribal artifacts is an ancient mask of petrified flesh, stitched and stapled together with hooked tendrils of straps to wrap around its head, dangling at its sides. That's the flavor for our mask trap, but feel free to flavor this any way you desire with an incentive to be worn by a player for any reason of your choice. But once donned, it latches onto their head with claws that dig into the back, as well as tiny little hooks that hook into their flesh that are on the inside of the flesh of the mask, so that it's just hooked into the flesh of their entire face, along with these heavy steel ones that grip into the back of their head. In our example that I just gave, the mask gives the player wearing it vision of these invisible tripwires, which were initially traps in and of themselves. This makes the players even less suspicious of the mask itself, which turns out to be the real trap. One person can don the mask and then see complete vision of all these tripwires and either navigate it to the other way and then deactivate them, or perhaps there is no way to deactivate them and that player can perhaps guide their allies across the room before they cross it themselves. Perhaps in your version, the mask allows them to see hidden glyphs that provide necessary information relative to the dungeon. Or perhaps there is no initial mask, but merely eye holes and an indent in the wall that provides a view into the next room. And should they fail to check for traps, the leathery film upon the wall that they press their face against latches onto their head. If the trap is discovered or even simply suspected, the player can just hold the mask off of their face to avoid contact, yet still peer through the eye holes to view the invisible dungeon aspects. Should the player be unlucky enough to have not checked for traps and now has this mask hooked onto their flesh, every time that player wearing the mask changes their expression, the mask pulls and rakes at their flesh as it moves. Mechanically, the player takes 1d6 plus 3 piercing damage at the start of each turn during combat, or every relative moment during a scene outside of combat. Or in the case of our example, every time a very high or very low roll on an ability check is made to traverse this room of invisible tripwires as they react in satisfaction or frustration accordingly. Removing the mask can have any requirement you wish. Maybe they have to make it laugh with a joke or tickling it with a feather. Or, borrowing the solution from our previous blade in the box example, maybe they push their face up against another person's or corpse's face, and the mask reverses and snaps onto their face. Our method is a bit more brutal. Skill checks for investigating, pouring about hints throughout the room, or knowledgeable players recalling ancient torture devices throughout history ultimately draw the player's attention to nails, tacks, or staples that are holding tapestries to the walls or threaded or staked into clothes or leathers amongst the environment, according to the dungeon theme. And these must be used to pierce the rough flesh of the mask to their own face, so that it can't flex and constrict. Then, with all kinds of nails and staples piercing the mask and their own face, they then, with it unable to flex and move and tighten, peel it away from one side of their face as they're ripping not only the hooks of the mask, but also the nails and staples that are in their face. Peel it and rip it all away. They take 1d12 piercing damage, and perhaps it causes permanent scars to their character's face. But hey, it's off. If they initially check for traps and get a low roll or a failure, they see that the mask has tiny hair-thin, hook-like tendrils upon the inside flesh, as well as the obvious hook-like strands that make up the head straps. On a high roll or a success, in addition to the above, they notice the flesh kind of twitches and recoils when prodded or handled, as if it's eager and primed to grip onto its wearer once placed upon the face. Now onto the reversed pit trap. You enter a 20-foot wide hallway with a 5-foot wide strip going down the center. And inside of this strip is a 20-foot deep pit with a collection of corpses and skeletons in varying states of decay mangled upon spikes, with quite a bit of valuables visible even at just a quick glance from above. You can easily walk around either side of the perimeter of the pit and cross this 50-foot long hall to enter the doorway to the next area, or you can investigate the pit and see what it may contain. What do you want to do? Walk into the hall and look down into the pit? Make a DC 20 dexterity saving throw as you step onto the solid stone floor of the hallway and then fall, as if the floor was intangible. And as you fall through the illusion, you see a spike pit awaiting 20 feet beneath you as you fall and contort within the air to avoid impalement. This trap's concept is simple, yet can cause quite the complication. The hallway is an illusion, reversing what is pit and what is the safe floor. In this case, the stone perimeter of the hallway floor is actually a massive U-shaped pit trap. And what appears to be a pit with a tantalizing amount of loot is actually the solid dungeon floor. What awaits within the pit, how to escape, and how punishing falling into it is completely up to you. If they check for traps and get a low roll or a failure, ask them how they'll be doing so. And if they neglect to care for the floor, have them make the dexterity save, but with advantage, as they were already on alert. If they get a high roll or success, the players deduce that the floor is intangible, and a quick toss of a pebble onto the pit reveals the pebble skidding across the top of the illusion at floor level. The tech magic also clearly announces the illusion. And that's it for that one. Now for magnets. The room to this tomb is lined with tall metal sconces lighting this promenade and providing a dim view of the distant antechamber beyond the ornate marble archway opposite the room from you. When you reach roughly 10 feet into the room, though it's difficult to describe, you feel as though you've just interrupted something. And suddenly, the temperature in the room flares hundreds of degrees as you reflexively throw yourself backward, and the temperature immediately returns back to normal in response. Everyone in the room takes 2d8 fire damage. Through deduction, you notice it was when you stepped to a point in the room where you were between these two dark black metal strips, roughly 6 inches thick, spanning from floor to ceiling, which are embedded into the wall on each side of the room, originally thought to just be part of the ornate decorum of the environment. Through some further investigation, you discover that these strips are magnetic, both positively charged, pushing against each other and depressing the locks to this scorching trap. And when a player passes between the two, the The force of these magnets against each other is interrupted in the section that they pass through, weakening the overall back pressure from the trigger, and the penalty occurs. The magnets can't have even the slightest negative differential, or they won't trigger. So the player would need to be completely covered in ferrous metal armor to not risk any metallic parts extending further out than the metal parts, or the pressure will be interrupted and cause the magnets to become repressed and cause the trap to trigger. The players can just rush their way across the room as one group and risk taking a massive amount of fire damage as they see there are several more of these strips in roughly 10-foot intervals across this very long room, and that's assuming they all trigger the same effects. Here's our solution. The whole idea is that these are two positively charged magnets that are pushing against each other, and they are so finely tuned that any interruption to that strip going from floor to ceiling is going to cause the trap to trigger. So it needs to be offset by at least an equal amount of whatever is going to interrupt it, which would be a player crossing the path. So remember those metal sconces that I mentioned earlier that were lighting the way? Or perhaps this room is lined with statues that have long, thick metal pole arms that are removable. If the players take that and wedge it horizontally in between the two magnets, because it is so long and dense, it's causing the magnets to now push even harder against each other. So, with it being literally suspended in the air, if the players wedge it chest height, and they are now being repressed even more, when the player limbos under it, or perhaps they put it lower and they step over it, it is now offset enough to where the parts that their body interrupt are offset by the extra force that this polearm is making upon the magnets. And they can one at a time grab a new one from the wall, or they can just stick the one in between the magnets, everyone crosses, and then the last person to cross reaches behind them, pulls it out, then they stick it in front of the next magnets, and then they continue all the way across the room. If the players initially check for traps and they get a low roll or a failure, the GM has no info on its magnetic properties, and the players have to further deduce or problem solve on their own to speculate the possibilities. If they get a high roll or a success, they deduce that they are magnetic, positively charged, and conclude with certainty that them crossing between the two strips and interrupting their push upon each other is what triggers the trap. If they roll super high, perhaps you even include that if they can offset whatever they're interrupting with ferrous metal, they may be able to make it across without activating it. And there you have it. 5 traps that you can drag and drop into your TTRPGs and have fun. You can take all of these exactly as I presented them, or you can just use them for inspiration to flavor your own. Our next video is going to be 3 actually interactive puzzles, and all 3 will be physical props that you can craft and create and bring to the table to make an actually interactive experience that blends physical puzzle solving along with using character skills and abilities and even combat. And included with these puzzles will also be 3 variations of them that require no props whatsoever and are strictly character skills, ability checks, and theater of the mind. Always remember that as long as everybody's having fun, then you're doing it right. I'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.